Over the last half century, over 1,200 people have gone missing from United States and Canadian national parks without any explanation for their disappearances. I'm Aiden Mattis, and these are their stories.
Dun dun.
Nice. So, if you like what we've been doing here at the Lore Lodge and you want to support our work, you can subscribe to us on Patreon at patreon.com/thelorelodge, subscribe to us on our website, lorelodge.com, or you can always just hang around for the show and give us a super chat now and then. We really appreciate any support, and with that said, enjoy the rest of the video. This channel essentially got its start talking about the national parks conspiracy, something that myself and several other people have talked about over the last few years regarding the fact that the national parks seem to just be hiding something. There's a lot of unexplained disappearances, there's restricted areas that don't totally make sense, considering that you can walk right up to hot springs that will dissolve your body in a matter of minutes, but if you go off the trail in a restricted area, rangers show up and stop you immediately. There's of course also the fact that when David Paulides, the man behind the Can-Am Missing Project and the popular documentary series Missing 411, goes and tries to contact the government about these cases, they stonewall him. In some cases, they've even gone so far as to remove records of his police service. There's a lot of really strange stuff going on surrounding the national parks and the Missing 411 phenomenon. And today, we're just going to go through what exactly the Missing 411 phenomenon is, and some possible explanations for it, ranging from the very mundane to the very supernatural. To start with, I think it's important to explain the profile points for a Missing 411 case. These are the criteria that determine if these get investigated by the Can-Am Missing Project team as something that counts as a Missing 411 case. Now, off the bat, there are several things that can disqualify a case from being investigated under these parameters. If a disappearance involves obvious signs of animal predation, suicidal intent or mental health issues, intentional disappearance, foul play, or something as mundane as drowning, it simply isn't considered because there are obvious explanations and it's not really worth spending the resources. So, in many cases when we talk about these things, especially if I'm talking about on TikTok or YouTube, we'll often get comments that say something along the lines of, oh, well, they probably just got lost, or oh, they probably fell into a cave, they probably drowned, they were probably murdered, they probably wandered off on purpose, they probably had suicidal ideation. These cases that we talk about, that David Paulides talks about, that Mr. Ballin talks about, these have already been combed and scrubbed for those kinds of things. If something involves an obvious crime, such as murder, then it just doesn't get investigated as this kind of case. And that's an important thing to note when discussing and researching these. Now, all of these cases do share general points. Usually they mark off at least half of these or possibly more. Those include that the disappearance happened near water, near a boulder field, or a large supply of granite. There are often berry shrubs around. There will often be sudden weather changes. Dogs will not be able to pick up the scent. The person goes missing at one elevation and appears at a radically different elevation, 2,000, 3,000 feet up a mountain. In many cases, the disappearing parties are children, such as Garrett Bardsley or Dennis Martin. And when the people are found deceased, there is no discernible cause of death in almost every single case. So, what exactly is going on? What's causing this? There are a lot of possibilities. Now, we can't rule out some of the more simple ones. Yes, the teams that are investigating and compiling these cases for the books and movies that discuss them are actually looking for signs of foul play. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to catch them. It could be that the person who committed a kidnapping or a murder was just very good at hiding the evidence. That is always a possibility, but if that seems likely, these cases don't really get investigated. If there seems to be motive for somebody to actually take on the individual who disappears, then it's the police's responsibility. That's not the job of private investigators like Paulides. And in many of these cases, what you have is people who simply disappear. For example, the case of Paul LeMay. This is a guy who was running the Mount Marathon race in Alaska. He got to the top of the mountain, saw the people who were in charge of timing the race. They basically were like, yeah, he's cool, you're okay, just make sure you get down the mountain safely, and he was never seen again. So despite the fact that he was seen just moments before reaching the point at which he would turn around and come back down the mountain, hours later they couldn't find him. They combed the entire mountain, the surrounding areas, and there was no trace. His family was there waiting for him. He had no signs of suicidal ideation, nor did he express any intent to disappear or leave his life behind. and yet he was just gone. Another good case is the case of Chris Tompkins, who went missing while on a surveying trip with a crew of 3 other men. He was at the back of the line, and the man in front of him would look back, make sure he was there every few minutes, and they'd keep marching along their trail. But one of the times that one of his buddies looked back, Chris had disappeared, and all that was left where he was one of his boots caught up in a barbed wire fence, his keys and some spare change that had fallen out of his pocket, and several hundred yards away, his other boot. And nothing, not a trace of his body or his belongings were ever found again. There were no tracks, there was no blood trail, no sign of a struggle. He simply just vanished. And then there's the case of Garrett Bardsley, who went missing in a boulder field near a lake. These are, of course, numerous things that all check off missing 411 profile points. Near boulder field, near water, child. One of his socks had fallen off, so that checks the missing clothing box. Dogs could not find a scent for him, and as far as anyone could tell, he simply vanished into thin air. So when it comes to these cases that really have no rational, reasonable explanation, that's when you have to start looking into supernatural or possibly preternatural phenomenon. Now, I'm not saying that that's just the first thing you should ever go to when something mysterious happens, but when lacking any other conceivable reasons for someone's disappearance, that's kind of the only thing you can do. And we've compiled a few possibilities for what's going on here. One of the most commonly suggested ones, if you go on the internet forums and look at this stuff, is alien abduction. And while I personally am not a believer in space aliens, they do bring up several good points. These people go missing completely out of the blue. There is no discernible trail of human markers that could explain what happened. Human beings, even if we are taking something from the air, it's loud, it's noisy. Even if you were to fly a helicopter in somewhere, throw a rope down, slide down it, grab somebody and pick them back up, in the time it would take you to do that, everyone around would notice that it was happening. So it can't be that. So perhaps something with super stealth capabilities and a tractor beam could actually pull somebody up into a spacecraft. Now, there have been lots of stories, especially in the United States and Canada, of alien abductions. I personally don't find many of them all that compelling, but a lot of people do, and it's a pretty common suggestion for this type of thing. One of the more mundane suggestions is that there are feral people living in the national parks, and this is something that was brought up by the TV show American Horror Stories, about 6 months after I started talking about this on the internet. I see what you did, American Horror Stories, and I want my credit. The idea here is that there were either missing hikers or Confederate Civil War veterans who went off into the wilderness, people who got stranded along the Oregon Trail, Native American tribes that were especially primitive and savage, who practiced things like cannibalism. And of course, that's not to suggest in any way that this is something common, or this is not supposed to stereotype Native Americans at all. I'm just giving you the story behind what people suggest may have happened. Now, as far as the concept of feral people living in the national parks goes, I think that's one of the more reasonable conspiracy theories out there. It is not entirely unbelievable that human beings who go off the grid for a long time might come back and be different. It's genuinely a very possible thing, and we've seen situations such as the Donner Party with, I believe it was Louis Keseberg, who he was out on his own for just a couple of weeks and committed acts of cannibalism, and it took him a long time to reintegrate into society. So if somebody can go mad that quickly, it's believable that several generations could see distinct changes from normal human social codes. Now, the problem with the feral people explanation is that it would usually show signs of a struggle. If somebody was being abducted by feral people while with others, it would be a very obvious commotion. Now, somebody going missing alone, that could possibly be a feral people situation. And in certain cases, for example, Charles McCuller, that would make more sense. People who were off doing their own thing alone in the woods and eventually disappeared and were found dead. So if it's a case of a lone person, feral people is a possibility. But a lot of these cases, the majority of these cases, the person is not alone. So what does that leave? Well, there's a few more possibilities. One of those is that these people are being abducted by something supernatural. And the Native Americans have a lot of stories about this. If you talk to the Ojibwa or any of the Algonquin groups, what you're going to find is that they believe in a spirit called the Wendigo. And the Wendigo is a demonic entity in some versions of this that takes over a person's body and turns them into a monster that is constantly craving human flesh, that doesn't care for creature comforts, and that is constantly just consumed by its desire to eat human flesh. In other versions of that story, it's not a demonic entity rather than a transformation that you undergo when being a cannibal for reasons of desperation or greed. In both cases, what you're talking about is something that has superhuman hunting abilities: stealth, super strength, super speed, the ability to mimic voices, but they're also covered in very emaciated, papery skin, so the way to kill them is to light them on fire. Now, why could this be an option? Well, they're known to live in the wilderness, specifically to inhabit caves or mine shafts, and to come out and hunt for food in the winter and when it's cold. Now, some of these cases, of course, don't happen in the winter, but that could just be a storytelling issue. Perhaps over time, the story of the Wendigo just got so associated with the winter that people began to believe it couldn't come out during the summer. But that's not necessarily the case. You could be dealing with a supernatural entity that doesn't follow the rules that we have set out for it. And, that was our mistake. It should be noted at this point that the Wendigo of folklore, of actual Native American folklore, is not the version that you see on the internet all the time. It does not have antlers. It does not have a deer skull for a head. It is a tall, gaunt, emaciated human being with shallow, sunken eyes, pale skin, and a constant desire to consume human flesh. Now, a kind of cross between this and the feral people idea occurs in the Nahanni National Park Preserve up in the Northwestern Territories of Canada. Now, up here, there are legends from the Native Americans about pale-faced demons that inhabit the valley, and a large number of people who went into that valley for prospecting purposes who ended up dead, headless, with their corpses burned. Now, dead and headless could be a Wendigo. Corpses burned indicates human beings. So we don't really know what's going on there. But it is strange nonetheless, and we of course have videos on everything that I've talked about so far today. One of my personal favorite theories here is something that is probably the most acceptable to the rationally minded, which is that people are disappearing into dimensional rifts. Yes, I did say rationally minded. I know we're making eye contact right now. So my suggestion here actually does have its roots not in science, but in folklore. And as is generally the case, science is very slowly catching up to general common knowledge among different indigenous groups from around the world, including the Celts and the Norse and the Native Americans. So what am I suggesting? What am I positing with this dimensional rift theory? Well, a lot of different cultures believed that if you entered cave systems, you could come out in a different place in the world or in time. And considering that all of these disappearances happen around cave systems, near them, usually within a couple miles at the very furthest, it makes sense that, maybe these people went into a cave to get out of the rain or something like that and ended up in a different dimension. Or perhaps some interdimensional being dragged them there. There are a number of possibilities here, but in some cases the dimensional rift theory works, in others not so much. And in most of these cases, it doesn't make a ton of sense why somebody would enter a cave or climb up one of these random staircases in the woods or whatnot. And yes, there are actually random staircases in the woods. I know you think it's a creepypasta, but there are in fact some of them. I'm not saying that all the creepypastas are true. I'm just saying that yes, there are random staircases in the woods that don't seem to have been attached to any building at any point in their history. And yes, that is weird and it is worth being confused about. But at the end of the day, none of these explanations really account for the entirety of the missing 411 phenomenon. And so it only seems fair that we cover this case by case, which is something that we here at the Lore Lodge plan on doing very soon. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.